our for our exempt employees. That's fine, whatever you want to do. Totally up to you, business decision. But you have to realize that what happens when non-exempt employees work remotely is that those lines between work and non-work time become fudged, okay? The baby cries, you run upstairs, you change a diaper, you answer a phone call, you come back to work. Was that work time? Is that break time? Okay? And it can put you and expose you as the employer to a potential claim for failure to pay overtime. So always set forth those requirements in the policy. Also set forth in the policy and the telecommuting agreement the requirements for their maintenance of a home work office, that it must meet OSHA requirements, and that the employee must be available to come into the office when needed for meetings. So all of this is going to help your employees understand ahead of time whether they are eligible to telecommute, what the eligibility requirements are, and it will also help support your decision of whether an employee may telecommute or not telecommute and prevent discrimination claims against you. Now, so that's how your procedures should be set forth for employees who telecommute. Now, you may be thinking, is a remote work arrangement considered to be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA that you might need to provide? And the answer is yes, it is. Okay? And just a heads up here, so what is the definition of a reasonable accommodation? It's any change in your policy or practice that is linked to someone's medical condition. So you might need to change your eligibility requirements if that opportunity to telecommute has been requested as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So as you know, the ADA is a federal law that protects only employees who meet the definition of being a qualified individual with a disability. And if they meet that definition and request a reasonable accommodation, then you are required to provide them with a reasonable accommodation of including telecommuting unless you can show that telecommuting would constitute a quote-unquote undue burden or undue hardship, which doesn't just mean, wow, that would be a big hassle to allow Melissa to telecommute. Rather, what it means is significant difficulty or significant expense for the employer. Now, what are some reasonable accommodations that you might be required to provide when an applicant or an employee requests an accommodation? And, of course, working remote is an important one. You also might have to provide ergonomic equipment or ergonomic furniture. And if you have an employee who is a qualified individual with a disability, they can also request when they're telecommuting that you provide them with that ergonomic chair or that ergonomic keyboard. A leave of absence, even after 12 weeks of FMLA leave, can be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA that you might need to provide. Allowing someone to work late duty, allowing them to work a part-time job, reassigning them to a vacant position. You never have to bump someone out of a position, but reassigning them to a vacant position can be something you have to provide. Providing a reader or interpreter, or, as I said, allowing them the opportunity to work remotely. So understand that when an employee comes to you and requests a reasonable accommodation, they do not need to use the words reasonable accommodation. They don't need to say ADA. They don't need to say disability. All they need to do is make you aware that they need a change in a policy or practice and link it to their medical condition. So Susie says, I need additional time to get my medications right due to my depression. That is a request for a reasonable accommodation. You should train your managers so they recognize that the employee has just requested a reasonable accommodation so they can run that walk to you in HR so you can immediately engage in the interactive process. Or if Sue says, I need to get up and walk around during meetings, sitting aggravates my chronic back condition, recognize that Sue's request constitutes a request for a reasonable accommodation, that you need to engage in the interactive process, and advise whether or not you can provide that accommodation or whether to do so would be an undue burden. Or Steve says, I need to work from home so I can get my chemotherapy, also a request for a reasonable accommodation. Now, an interesting recent case on working remotely as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So this was EEOC versus Ford Motor Company, when the employee, Jane Harris, she was a resale buyer at Ford. So her job required that she serve as this sort of intermediary between steel suppliers and companies that use steel to manufacture parts for Ford. And as part of her job, she had to meet regularly with suppliers at their work sites and with Ford employees at their sites. So here, she had irritable bowel syndrome, and she requested a reasonable accommodation to telecommute just a few days a week as a reasonable accommodation, and Ford said no. On what basis did they deny her request? Well, one of their arguments was that she was not entitled to a reasonable accommodation because she was not a qualified individual with a disability. Why not? Because they claimed that she couldn't perform the essential functions of her job with or without an accommodation, because they claimed physical presence in the workplace was an essential function of her job. Now, this case was first decided by a 3-member panel of the Sixth Circuit. Then it was overturned by the Sixth Circuit sitting en banc. But it is that 3-member panel's rationale and reasoning that is important for our purposes today. Even though it was ultimately overturned, it will be recognized by other courts. They will seize upon this as an important issue with regard to working remotely and reasonable accommodations. And that is that the court said, look, employers, if you are going to claim that physical presence in the workplace is an essential function of someone's job, two important things. First of all, let me remind you that we are working in the 21st century, where it is so easy for employees to telecommute because of all these electronic devices and software that we have, and the ability to participate in webinars and conference calls and Skype and FaceTime and texting and instant messaging, etc., number one. So if you're going to really claim with how easy it is for most people to perform their jobs remotely, that physical presence is an essential function of the job, number one, you better make sure that the facts really support that. And number two, you better make sure that you have added physical presence in the workplace on the employee's job description as one of their essential functions of doing their job. And in this case, the facts really didn't support it, because all she was doing on a daily basis was engaging in teleconferences and Skypes, and she could have easily have done that from home. So make sure that you have well-drafted ADA accommodation policies in your employee handbooks, and procedures for engaging in the interactive process, and procedures for determining whether or not you can provide a qualified individual with a disability with the accommodations they have requested. And look, I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, it is your managers who create legal liability for your organization. Make sure that you have provided training to your managers so that they don't cause liability for your organization. Make sure managers understand how to recognize when an employee has requested a reasonable accommodation, and they understand how to that working remotely can be a reasonable accommodation. They just run to you in HR, and that's all they need to know, but at least they need to know that. Now, I will tell you also that much of what we're talking about today is really states who have passed laws that you need to be aware of in 2018 in the coming years. And one of these are paid sick leave laws.